Thanks, Alex. Take it away.
Hooray! Okay, nice to be here. Wait, I'm in the way of my own slides. All right, splendid. Let's kick off. Well, I think first what I wanted to do was say a little bit about how I met Lorien in the first place, because I feel like that's sort of a fun and pertinent story. That's my slide, but there's a little piece of video we've got that goes with it. I was doing originally some research in collaboration while I was doing a research stint at Princeton with the people at the Institute for Advanced Study. There's a wonderful discussion group there that works on abiogenesis, so you know, the origin of life. I was sort of studying how cooperation, so I studied cooperation at multiple scales, both oh my lord. Okay, study cooperation, you know, both at sort of chemical systems, you know, biological systems, you know, human systems, you name it. So essentially, coming out of that research, I ended up doing a collaboration for the SETI Institute with a wonderful chap, Ethan Summers, a fantastic guy who's an Emmy award-winning computer graphics person. We built an outreach project for the SETI Institute that was essentially was an artificial life program that literally did abiogenesis while you watched. We have 5 out of 7 of the requirements for a fully living organism, which we're able to get to happen in under a minute. So this is an example of some of the sort of beautiful, sort of crazy, quirky visuals of that thing building itself. But because of that, I was there at the Frontier Development Lab, which is a magnificent event which is run by NASA and SETI in collaboration, talking about how you can use AI and machine learning to solve human-scale problems. Like, for instance, you know, whether or not rocks are going to drop out of space and sort of hit major cities and that sort of thing. So that was a wonderful introduction, and from that I got into this conversation with Lorien about the work that we were doing with SETI, and we got into a larger conversation about, you know, the use of decision intelligence and the use of AI to try to effect meaningful change. And I felt extremely motivated to be engaged with her process and the vision that she and Feroz have been building this community with. So with that in mind, so you can see there the sort of the lovely, strange, and wonderful things. If anybody's interested in how life starts or how you can interact with it in, you know, using your hands with a VR bucket on your head, I will be more than happy to explain at the end of the talk. But now let's move on to the main content of the talk. Let's fold that concept and talk about like cooperation of exactly the same sort that you see in these subcellular systems and how it relates to this, you know, looking at the opposite end of the scale. What happens if we look at cooperation from the standpoint of trying to save the entire world? So it looks like we're nearly there in slide land. All right, almost. It's terribly exciting. Here we go, nearly, and I should probably babble engagingly while the technical process continues. Suffice to say, the way in which we did this, this particular artificial life thing, is we created a staged chemistry in which the form of self-organization that life requires is extremely easy to come about. So we were able to compress many millions of years of evolution into basically just simply a matter of seconds, so that you were able to see how we would be able to go from literally dumb matter to basically predator-prey dynamics happening in front of you while you watched. I wanted this to be the first feature of what happened with talk, because anyone here heard of Stuart Kauffman? He's a very, very brilliant thinker, but he was a guy who pointed out that one of the primary requirements for life is what you might call an autocatalytic set. So a set of compounds which catalyze each other's production, if you like, and through the act of catalyzing each other's production, they're able to create a sort of a feedback cycle that's capable of, you know, so those cells operating, those compounds operating in concert, collaborating together, is capable of creating creating a living system. Now, the interesting thing about that process of cooperation, it's rather like the prisoner's dilemma game we were playing up earlier, is that cooperation happens at all scales. It's something that it's a pattern that is common to all levels of organization of every system, everything from the subcellular to the social. So now I'll move on and try and cover the actual main focus of the talk. What I'm going to talk about first, talk about engineer optimism. This is something we talk about at ProductOps. It's something that I'm personally passionate about. I think there are different kinds of optimism. I personally am an optimist about saving the world, but I think there is naive optimism, if you like, and there's a kind of optimism which is the kind of that I believe can really make a difference, which is that when you're an engineer, you look at a system and you look at all the different, you've responsibility for maintaining or fixing something. You first look at all the ways in which it's broken, and you're very honest about it, and you go, oh, that's broken, there's bugs in there, yeah, that doesn't do what it's supposed to do, that doesn't speak to its API properly, and so on and so forth. You go through and you understand all the ways in which your system is busted, and then you roll your sleeves up, and then you effect a fix, having figured out the ways in which your system is busted. And I intend to do that, or hope to inspire a dialogue in which we do this collectively together for the entirety of the human race and the planet on which we live. Huzzah! No small subject there, but that's the idea. So what I'm going to do in the spirit of that is outline three, what I would propose as key problem areas that I see the world facing right now. So we're going to go to a little bit of a dark place, but I think it's an appropriate dark place because we are talking about saving the world. Then I'm going to propose a solution. And the proposal I have is the best one that I've got, best possible solution I've come across thus far. But really what I want to do with that is open a dialogue. Because if the purpose of this community is for us to all start thinking together. So this is a concrete proposal of how we might go about effecting massive global specific change that would offset several, if not hopefully all, of the major problems that we're facing as a species. So problem facet number one is what I would describe as artificial stupid. So we've already talked, you've heard some wonderful conversations here, people discussing the idea of AGI, general intelligence, and the fact that general intelligence is actually not as near, not as close as many people might propose that it is. Everyone from sort of Vint onwards have been talking about both the importance of complexity and understanding the complexity of the global system, but also the fact that, general intelligence is, it's somewhat far away and it's maybe not realistically actually the main threat in the system. What I would propose to you is that general intelligence is not actually needed for the machinery around us to constitute an extremely lively and exciting threat, an existential sort of humdinger for how we operate as a species. And the reason for that is because essentially we reason collectively. I should pedal back. In order to disrupt the functions and the means via which we operate as a species, we do not need general intelligence. All we need to do is disrupt the mechanism via which human beings operate with each other. Because whilst a lot of our attention is focused on general intelligence and the potential threat of something that's giant and scary and super clever, in actual fact, all you need is to have something that comes in between and alters the way in which a social network is written. We've also heard some wonderful discussion today about the importance of the social network. We also heard about warm data. In fact, information is hiding in the interrelationships between things, between people in a system. There's a huge body of research to suggest that essentially we reason collectively. As per the content that Nora shared with us, we don't reason in isolation. The quantifiable data that we can see around us is not the be-all and end-all of who we are. In actual fact, I would propose that there is a huge subconscious channel for reasoning that is going on all around us. We have a tendency to, there's some books here. Well, here's some exciting books that make this point. So you've got Social Physics by Alex Pentland, The Secret of Our Success by Joseph Henrich, The Knowledge Illusion by Sloman and Fernbach. They all essentially make the same point, which is that we do not operate in the way in which we imagine that we do, such as, we imagine that we take input from the world and we make clever, intelligent decisions, and that affects what we do. And that what differentiates us from other species is the idea that we are smarter than other species. As it turns out, there are many intelligence tests that you can give to human beings and apes in which the apes score about as well as the human beings. What is different for human beings is that we have this incredible process of idea contagion. We can take knowledge through language from other people, internalize it, and turn that into sort of an accumulated body of social learning, complex, interconnected social data that then impacts how we operate and how we behave. This book, likewise, therefore also addresses what I would propose as the key issue here, which is that those processes of interrelation and social cross-pollination of ideas have essentially been subverted. If you look, this book basically provides a truly stunning account of the ways in which social media, and indeed media in general, have essentially rewritten the way in which human beings interact with each other. So we see plenty of polarization in the news. We see plenty of polarization happening in social media and the like. We see this sort of slide towards a form of kind of like bizarre nationalism that happens in a variety of different countries around the world, whether or not you're talking about things that are happening in the US with Trump, or with Turkey, or with the Philippines, or with Brexit in Britain. It pretty much doesn't matter where you look. You see some instantiation of this. And in some places, people perceive to themselves that it's about immigration or some such thing, and in other places, it's to do with indigenous rights. But the pattern remains the same. You can basically look at this pattern of nationalization, this pattern of rising fear, and this pattern of rewriting the social dialogue. In actual fact, it's something systemic that's happening because the way in which we communicate with each other has changed, because the shape of the social networks has changed. So from my own research, I can tell you that I did some research while doing my Princeton stint on collective animal decision making. There's a wonderful process, basically the same mechanism of making collective decisions shows up in bees, it shows up in shoals of fish, it shows up in herds of wildebeest, where essentially you have a few informed individuals, information propagates out into the group, individuals basically decide to follow on for one or more informed individuals, and then the group forms a consensus, and then the group makes a decision. And this really doesn't matter whether or not you're looking at, picking a new location for a hive or a bunch of yaks looking for a water source. It's essentially the same thing. With human beings, we do exactly the same thing in dialogue. This sort of subconscious channel of communication operates the same way. But if you take that same process and you put it on a scale-free social network, the kind of social network which we tend to build, that process breaks down and it starts producing really bad decisions. Now, here's the irony. The process of preferential attachment via which we do that collective reasoning is also the process via which we build these social networks. So without conscious intervention, the process of how we just build social networks in the first place leads us spontaneously to this place where our quality of our decision making just continues to degrade. And the irony is that the people who at some level experience the most amount of idea distortion are those people who are acting most to try to distort the network. So the propagandists in the system who are working hard to disseminate false information effectively self-hack, because they essentially, not only are they constantly pumping out incorrect information because they have some specific agenda that they want to pursue, but in doing so they make it impossible for the correct information they need to propagate through them. So that continues to justify the ill-conceived ideas that they have, and so the system enters a feedback loop. So where does this go? What is the shape of this process? Well, essentially what it does is it puts us on about a 30-year fuse to a major international conflict. Because as the nationalism ratchets up and everyone gets more and more scared, what you're going to see is a polarization of groups, and it's essentially going to evolve into, significant intergroup tensions, and that will result in war. Hooray! Or not. But anyway, I'll move quickly on to facet number 2. There's another fascinating thing here to do with how altruism works in human societies. I did a bunch of research on modeling what makes altruism work in large-scale human societies. Like, we know how altruism works at the scale of societies that people are naturally, sort of organically supposed to operate in, which is around Dunbar's number, which is 100 to 150 people. But historically, we haven't really understood how altruism works at societies at much larger scales. We know, for instance, that institutions really matter. You can look at, for instance, North Korea versus South Korea. And there's good people living in both of those countries. There are people who are ethically minded and determined and well-intentioned and kind to their neighbors in both places. But in one place, we have extremely productive social outcomes that are happening that create an equitable society, and the other place we do not. So the ways in which human society self-organize makes a difference. So I was challenged by a friend when I was doing my Princeton stint to basically see if I could model this. And I took my cue from a wonderful thing in genetic theory, which is there are these things in genes called selection distorter genes. Anybody heard of a selection distorter gene? Okay, a selection distorter gene is a gene. Let's call him Tim the gene. So what Tim would say in a cell is it's a gene that basically says, forget about this reproduction business, just make more of me. So Tim's like, don't worry about reproduction, make more Tim. And so Tim makes a copy of Tim, the cellular machinery in the cell makes another Tim, and then suddenly there are two of Tim. And the two Tims then say, forget about this reproduction business, just make more Tim. And then suddenly there are 4 Tims, and then 8 Tims, and so on and so forth until the cell dies. It's extremely easy to have one of these selection distorted genes arise, so you can ask the question, how does cellular life exist at all? And the answer is, all of the other genes in the cell essentially pay an expressiveness tax in order to keep the selection distorted genes at bay. So they engage in a process of slightly crypto-locking the machinery in the cell via which the cell reproduces so that the representation of the genetic machinery remains stable. So this is referred to as the parliament of genes. So it occurred to me, well, oh my goodness, am I really down to 4 minutes? That's absolutely shocking. So the idea here is that I thought, well, we don't need to necessarily think just about the parliament of genes. We can talk about parliaments. We can use exactly the same material and talk about how human beings operate in groups. What we find is that when we do this, so first thing I did was I attempted to model the operation of the genes, and I could replicate that. When you attempt to do the same thing modeling societies, it breaks down. And the reason why it breaks down is that the reason why it works for genes is that when cells reproduce, there are then copies of cells where reproduction has succeeded. So those cells that do keep their act together outcompete those cells that do not. In human societies, they have a tendency to aggregate. If you look at the scale of human societies over the course of the lifespan of human civilization, societies have gotten larger and more complex. So what that means is that the collective social pressure that encourages altruism to maintain itself disappears once you get up to a fully globalized system, which is why we're seeing what we're seeing now. I built a simulation that models this, and at first it looks like you're building up to this golden era of everybody working together and a sort of a beautiful outcome. And then something scary happens where all of a sudden the whole system turns on a dime and we're not seeing that anymore. All of a sudden, everything goes to poverty and ashes, and it happens really quite quickly. So what we're seeing here is the fact that we've coupled to a global system, we've created a global commons, which is a perfect storm, if you like, for what you might think of as social defectors to come in and to basically capitalize upon that global commons, which is why we're here in the room now having this conversation about this. I should say, just backing up one moment, that what this means is that any fix we come up with must address this boundary issue problem. Anything which is constantly globalizing is going to run into problems. It also means that any long-term fix that we implement has to involve loose coupling, some kind of social loose coupling. Briefly talk about the third problem, which we might think of as a descending ceiling. Today, this week, we saw in the news the fact that Bolsonaro has been turned a blind eye to the burning of the Amazon rainforest. I put this slide together before any of that stuff happened, but it seems wildly pertinent. Essentially, there are 2 factors at play. First, you might think of as global downsizers. We have a problem with the climate. We know that, but that's not the only problem we have. We have problems with biodiversity. We have increased levels of pollutants. We've got all these plastics showing up in the middle of the ocean. We've got the depletion of easy access resources. The problem with that is that all of those factors that are essentially curtailing our development start to decrease the speed of global growth. And what that does is it promotes risk-seeking behaviors, because when growth slows down, people start looking for ways to reclaim or gain or keep hold of their advantage. So you get what you might think of as risk-seeking behaviors that come out. So who here has read Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman? Anybody here? So people have come across that. Okay, an excellent book. A point he makes there in prospect theory is if I say to you, I'll give you $100, or we'll do a deal. If we flip a coin, if it comes up heads, you get $200, or if it comes up tails, you get nothing at all. People will usually say, I'll keep the $100, thanks. If you turn it the other way around and you say, we'll flip a coin, and if I'm going to take $100 from you, or we can flip a coin, and if it comes up heads, I take $200 from you, or if it comes up tails, I take nothing. But when it's framed in a loss, all of a sudden, what happens is that people will say, oh, I'd rather just, I'll flip a coin because maybe I don't incur a loss. It's exactly the same from a mathematical standpoint. But people, as soon as things are framed in losses, start to engage in risk-seeking behaviors. So what we see here is that there's a whole slew of behaviors which are risk-seeking behaviors which are showing up. So we get the rise of certain kinds of nationalism which are specifically focused on people holding onto resources ever more tightly. We see the migration of peoples because they're struggling as basically growth slows or as it becomes harder and harder to make a living. We get people driving attention into alternative forms of economics. It's risky, but maybe it's going to net a big gain. So, for instance, Bitcoin, which now uses up more energy than Switzerland, as it turns out. And so what that does is it drives slowly towards essentially a point of self-organized criticality. All of these tensions going together essentially create a problem because those behaviors, panic nationalism, are like feedback, as per the point to do with the Amazon. So it's not just that one affects the other, it's that as soon as people start exercising in more of these escape behaviors, the worse things are going to get, the more that the ceiling comes down and the feedback process crunches it all together. So any fix that we come up with must be systemic. It must address all of these issues. If it doesn't address all of the issues, then we've got a serious problem on our hands. So looks like I'm out of time, so I'm going to have to be very quick. How do we frame a solution? Engineer optimist style. The first important thing that we need to do is lean into change. You cannot prevent change. Change happens, but you can at least pick the kind of change that you want to see. We can repurpose the problem factors. So the information that we see about there, the problems that are happening, we can look at the details of those problem factors and find ways to make use of them. We can look for concrete, achievable solutions, and above all, we can use decision intelligence. We can figure out what the outcomes and the inputs to these systems are and figure out a way to build something that's actually going to work. I would propose to you something that I refer to as the Roddenberry plan. If we have these social media and media demons whispering in our ears the whole time, I would propose that what we actually need are digital angels. So I propose that we take that non-conscious channel of communication, which we were talking about before, and which we saw some of the dynamics of working up with the improv game earlier, and we use it to create essentially a mass-produced amount of content which we burst out into social media channels to offset the polarizing content that's been being produced by state and corporate actors, people like Russia and what have you. And the act of doing that, of diluting the noise of the polarization that's happening, is it basically will help solve the global coordination problem that we have. It reverses artificial stupid. It stalls the global coupling problem. It doesn't get rid of it, but it certainly stalls it. And it reduces the escape behaviors, because rather than people inhabiting this feedback system of negativity, all of a sudden that pattern has changed. So it enables us potentially to become our best selves. That's the hope. So it requires a large-scale active broadcast of information specifically related to getting people to think rationally about what they do and how they act. So we're talking about the use of AI, and we're talking about the use of decision intelligence, because we're using tools that exist in AI now to seek out specific cases where radicalized speech and action are showing up. And instead of attempting to distort the decision state itself, what we do is we talk to the processes via which decisions are made. We ask questions. We say things like, how do you reason that? Where does that come from? So specifically what we do is we attempt to target tech decision makers, because the technology industry is a place where we can affect a difference here. What we offer these people is that we stabilize that sector in the face of increasingly loud calls for them to reform or to be publicly accountable. Our role is to act as advocates, and we engage in global automated decision intelligence. We use the question of asking people how, asking people why, reframing the question of like, why do you believe that? We use bots, we use sock puppets, we use all of these things that have already been broken out into the world, but we use it in the name of trying to get people to be more rational. So we're not trying to shape opinion, we're trying to shape the process via which opinions are made. And we essentially, from that, build a framework for growth. An important key piece of this is that we have to frame it in terms of a giant opportunity. Human beings only work effectively together if there is a large positive net outcome. One of the problems with the way in which issues with the world are faced is we frame it in terms of a problem instead of framing it in terms of what we get after the solution. Global coupling-wise, we know that a loose coupling solution is really an important part of what we'll need to do next. So the easiest way to do loose coupling is essentially to put some people on Mars, but we can't put people on Mars on a 30-year fuse. We need to do better than that. So instead, we think of it framing in terms of growing the world. People already mentioned the UN SDGs. That's an example of the kind of exact things that we should be focusing on, and I can give more detail on that afterwards if you like. I'll be quick because I'm out of time. But essentially, what's next? What's next for us? Well, we attempt to secure support. We flesh out this Roddenberry plan. I can talk afterwards about the details of how and why I believe that it works. We transform tech. We work together because it is a critical choke point via which we can apply specific technology that we already know how to build in order to change the process via which decisions are being made, not by specific leaders, but broadly speaking across the entire human collective. We aim to save the world, and then we aim for 10,000 safe, prosperous years afterwards. So that's what we aim for. Thank you. Thank you all for listening. Even as I ran out of time, let's talk. I'm open for any and all questions. Probably not now, because we're probably horribly out of time, but Feroz, yes.
Just quickly, Alex, you spoke about digital angels.
Yes.
We don't have, I mean, if you look at what news does, it's all amplify negativity, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, because that's the business model that works.
Yes.
I mean, my friend actually started a news channel about positive news, and he had to shut down because there's no business model there.
Right.
So how does this, the idea of digital angels work in the world that we live in today?
Right. How does it work? Well, the first thing that we have to do is we have to create about 3 times as much noise as the negativity, which is quite a lot of noise that we have to create. We have to create quite a lot of call to rationality. But what we have working on our side and what we can offer the tech sector is the fact that understanding this subconscious channel via which human beings connect together is something that we can also use to create growth and to create prosperity. So for instance, if we understand, we can use the science that's being delivered of how human beings interrelate and cooperate, we can use that to actually drive revenues for those tech companies. We can help them create more effective social groups and social media platforms that will engage people. So there is a host of subconscious tools that are becoming visible via this research that's going on. So I believe that, we're not necessarily looking at positive news. I mean, trying to deliver something positive exactly falls into the pitfall of the fact that how things are being framed. What we do instead is we think in terms of goal states, and we think in terms of creating a standard for how people come to a decision. So for instance, let's say that we are using some sort of media entity which is posing as a member of a group that is becoming radicalized. And we say, how does this work? What's our outcome? What goals are we really actually looking for here? What happens after this? You say we should lock these people out, but then what? Where does the money come from? So what we can do is we can soften and reshape these forms of radicalism and these forms of essentially non-functional behavior by asking decision-intelligent questions about what are the outcomes. So this isn't a total answer. Part of what I want to share here is that I feel this is maybe 50% of an answer, because you're dead right. In order to make this Roddenberry plan work, it has to be effective and it has to speak to the interests, the specific goals of those organizations as they exist now. Unless we have that, we don't have the totality of the plan. Just telling people we have concrete evidence that if we don't do something explicit, that everything is going to go to hell in a handcart in 30 years is probably not going to be enough, because people will say, well, maybe that won't happen. You know, we can point at all of the evidence that points and converges to exactly that place. It probably still won't work because people are so focused on revenue and they're so focused on the reality that they are currently inhabiting. If we can focus people on the growth and the state that comes out of the back of that, then interesting stuff, I think, can possibly come about. It's a big, chewy, fascinating subject of how do we make this fully plausible. It's better than the other two solutions I have, which is, you know, the best solution normally for a complex system is, you know, if you think about forest management, you have a controlled burn. You know, a controlled burn in the context of the human race means probably about 1 billion people taking it in the neck. I don't want to live in a controlled burn world. You know, the other thing is basically we create a loosely coupled system by creating independent political entities that are somewhere other than the world. That's very, very expensive. This kind of plan looks cheaper and more effective than that strategy, but still is going to involve a huge amount of work. I won't say it won't. But anyway, that's probably about it.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you.